So welcome back for those of you that were here yesterday, and welcome for anyone that wasn't here. I think I'll dispense with going around the room again since we did that today, but we'll go ahead and get it started. I'm Paul Waddell, President of Synthicity and Professor at UC Berkeley. And we're going to spend today going in quite a bit of detail into UrbanCanvas to complement the UrbanSim discussion yesterday. And I can reassure you that we won't be showing you any equations today. It'll be a lot more graphical, and I think you'll really enjoy this. So we're going to get into first an overview of UrbanCanvas and what it's for, what we designed it to do, what use cases and workflows it's designed to support. And then we'll get into a lot more detailed discussions about how to use it to solve specific kinds of problems. And so I encourage you to ask questions at least between the sessions, and we'll defer to the individual presenters about taking interruptions along the way. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason Oliveira to kick us off today.
Great. All right. So just to give an overview of the day. Okay, sure. How's the audio there? A little better? Okay. So today we're going to talk about UrbanCanvas, and we're going to break it up into a few sessions. This morning we'll start with an overview describing the reason that we embarked on the endeavor of creating UrbanCanvas and the problems that we're trying to solve with it. And then we'll talk a little bit about the shared regional data set that we use for both UrbanSim and UrbanCanvas in some detail that Connor will present. And then in the afternoon, we'll look at some additional use cases of UrbanCanvas around scenario planning and more design type work. And we'll conclude the day with some discussion about what priorities should be for the next steps, and then a hands-on session where we'll give you a chance to kick the tires on some of our laptops. So starting off, why we created UrbanCanvas in the first place. I'm going to explain this in the form of a story. So we're going to imagine an imaginary metropolitan region called Over There and talk about some of the issues that they have over there. So over there is a coastal region comprised of two municipalities, Northton and Southville. They're about to embark on a streetcar project that spans the two cities, and they want to coordinate the transportation and land use in their region. So decades ago, they created the Over There Metropolitan Council of Governments to manage this process. Oh my cog. And we have a cast of characters that are involved in this kind of work. So at the municipal level, we have city planners and urban designers. Same in Southville. And then we have a regional planner that'll be the kind of prototypical. So we changed the names, but we've heard these stories 100 times, so we're protecting the innocent here. So we'll start with Reggie, the regional planner, and some of his concerns. So he is managing a lot of data coming from a lot of sources, and one of his primary data sources is state demographers and economists who are projecting population growth in his region. We also have a lot of information coming from assessors in cities, parcel data. It's frequently updated or infrequently updated, and comes in a variety of formats, and he has to manage that. He also hears a lot from the real estate development community about the land development projects that are happening or might happen, and also the proposed transportation projects that are happening in the region, and what kinds of policies the policymakers are concerned about. So what does Reggie think about day to day? And you can tell me if I'm wrong. We need to coordinate development between the municipalities in the region. We'll use the streetcar line as an example. How do we make sure we coordinate transportation and land use? How is this going to affect traffic? How do we prioritize development in what areas so that we meet our objectives for environmentally sustainable, socially equitable, socially just, and financially sound development in the region? So that's what Reggie's thinking about. Then we have, at the city level, our city planner or urban designer who have a different set of concerns. So they're hearing from the regional planner, we need to increase capacity in these areas that we've established as priorities, and we want to preserve greenfields. And they're hearing from concerned citizens. You know, we want to maintain the quality of life, but do it in an affordable way and provide housing for everybody. So the city planner is thinking, how are we going to craft policy in order to meet these objectives? Designers thinking, how do we do this and promote good urban form that has a whole other set of concerns? And again, they're always beholden and responsible to be good stewards for the citizens in the region and to be able to communicate effectively to them what the changes are going to be like for their neighborhoods and what things are actually going to look like. The problem is, it's a lot of work to do this. There's a lot of data required. We discussed this at length yesterday. And once you've spent 80 to 90% of your budget collecting data, you don't have a lot of time to study the number of options or the depth, to the depth that you'd like to once you've done all the background work. So the additional problem is, you know, doing this in your own municipality is one thing, and then coordinating with your neighbors is another. So Southville, same concerns. You know, what are they doing in our neighboring region as well? So there needs to be a better way to do planning and design in a regional context. This is our motivation. So, you know, exiting storybook world and coming to the real world, we recognize that there's a lot of different tools that are used today to engage in this kind of process, all the way from data management to presentation to the public, and the kind of feedback loops that we get that can often be really inefficient. We're using a wide range of applications for both managing and editing and communicating data, for doing land use plans, transportation plans, and designs on the site level. And what we use to create our plans and designs isn't necessarily what we use to present them or analyze them. So right now we might use tools like ArcGIS, Excel, AutoCAD, Illustrator, Rhino if you're a designer, SketchUp maybe Photoshop, and you're sending things via email over and over and over and over again. So our vision is to integrate. So we're not going to be all of these tools, but we do know the workflows around urban planning and urban design and regional planning, and really feel like there's room for making this process much more efficient. So our vision for UrbanCanvas is from all the way to the point of getting initial data from its raw sources, at least raw sources from the point of view of the planning community, and to the point of presenting to the public, having an integrated environment. So we made a huge amount of progress in the last year that we're going to show you. And you know, throughout the day, please take notes on things that you think we could do to improve, and things that you're excited about, so we know we keep going in the right direction to achieve this vision. So, big picture, the things we want to do with UrbanCanvas: collaborate and communicate, visualize, really focus on early stage prototyping. So that point in the process where we're going from zoning to a first stab at forms to understand what kind of capacity we're providing, what's the general urban form that could result from different policy decisions. And that we're lumping into design and editing, and always having a tight loop to analysis, and the ability to look at different options through the mechanism of comparing scenarios. So I'll explain one feature, and then I'll hand it off to Carlos to describe a little bit more about UrbanCanvas. So collaboration. What we're looking at is a screenshot from UrbanCanvas, and we're just about to release a new set of features for commenting to take one big step towards this collaborative environment. So going back to our cast of characters from before, we have a regional planner that's identified the area highlighted in blue as a priority development area. And what we're trying to do is consolidate residential development around this transit stop. The question he has are the targets that we're establishing feasible for the kind of capacities we're talking about. So he puts a comment on this development project in UrbanCanvas, and then gets a response from the city planner who's saying, well, we'll take a look at it and see if current zoning provides enough capacity, and whether it's consistent with our neighborhood development plan for the area. She's working with the urban designer in the same city, who's going to put together some specific proposals going from kind of a generic look. Here those are abstract bars, those are not skyscrapers, they're just a 3D bar chart, effectively saying we have a mix of residential use in yellow here and non-residential use in blue. And what he's going to do is start to do some massing models with some prototypical facades to say, okay, if we want to achieve that, we'd actually have to upzone. So neighborhood plan says we want to put a park here, but we're not going to be able to do both in terms of meeting residential capacity and putting the park unless we make some changes. So Cindy takes a look. She's looking at the area takeoffs in UrbanCanvas and says, okay, but we're not there yet. Nice thing is, if you do use this in a collaborative fashion and have an open communication through this kind of comment string, someone in a neighboring community can say, all right, well, we're planning this transit line. One stop away is a park. It's not there yet, but we're planning it. So being able to have one environment where it's a live tracking mechanism for planned projects allows this kind of earlier communication to happen. This is our vision for how we think it can work. I mean, obviously there's organizational concerns, but this is how we can see this working in an ideal environment. So Urban Designer from Southville says, no, this stop is 5 minutes from the area that you're looking at planning, and maybe this satisfies the need for additional open space, which will allow you to not provide it in your PDA, but instead provide the residential use that's needed around the stop. So ultimately, the regional planner says, this is great. We've balanced the need for both accessibility to the park and providing housing near the transit stop. Central to this is the ability to control permission to do what within the shared database. So as soon as you start sharing data, you want to manage who gets to edit what and who gets to see what. We've just started to implement that. We have the ability to control editing. Right now, everyone can view everything in UrbanCanvas, but you have restricted permissions based on your geography for editing. So this is one thing we'd like to hear more about from you guys. When we say everyone, this is everyone who's using UrbanCanvas, and right now that's within the governmental agencies, not necessarily the public. So we can talk about this on a region-by-region basis, but we definitely recognize the need to have managed permissions. So for example, if the urban designer in Northton decides to propose something in Southville, he's not going to be allowed to unless he's explicitly given permissions by an administrator. So right now we're the administrator, but we're working on having a administrator system in UrbanCanvas so that you can change privileges within your organizations. So I'm going to hand the baton a bit to Carlos Venegas, who's our CTO, and he's going to talk a bit more about the big picture of UrbanCanvas's features.
All right, it's great to see you all again. Thanks for showing up for this morning session. So as Jason said and Paul said during the introduction, we've been working heavily on UrbanCanvas since the last time we had a chance to show you a very early version about a year ago, a little longer than a year ago. We've been working very closely with our clients, with the regions, with the MPOs to try to understand, better understand the workflows that you normally have and what problems you normally run into that you would like to be able to address better. And we've been bringing all that into our development team. Jason is more or less the intermediate layer between clients and the development team, and Eddie and others are also a great help in translating needs into the language of software engineers. And so, as they say, today is the day to show you how we're responding to that, and both what we've done in the last months and what we intend to do in the coming months. So here's a quick overview, and throughout the day we'll be going into a lot more detail into in all of these features. So this is geospatial data associated to cities. This is the way it's stored. It's a table. This is the way it's often visualized if you're just accessing the data in databases. This is the underlying data that we access when we're interacting in UrbanCanvas. And so we have multiple tables. Some tables represent the data in buildings. Some tables represent the data in parcels. You can have development projects, you can have proposals, scenarios, but in the end, it's all tables. So clearly, if you are presented with this representation of the data, it's going to be difficult to make sense of what is here. It's going to be difficult to see patterns, to understand trends, and that's the whole idea of having visualization. So the worst case scenario, you have only data in this numeric and tabular format. And what GIS has been all about in the last decades is transforming all this data into maps, into visual representations of the data. So in UrbanCanvas, clearly we understand that sometimes it's useful to be able to view the data in its original form, in a tabular form, and we support display of the data in that way. And so the next step that has been made is to, again, represent this data in maps. So this is traditional GIS. You have a 2D map. When you have a table of parcels, for example, each parcel has a geometry, as you know. So you have the contour or the contours that enclose the area that is contained by the parcel or by each parcel. And then you might have numeric attributes associated to each parcel, which you can then convert into a color using a variety of color scales. And this is, again, this is traditional data visualization in the form of a map. All the maps that you see on the walls in this room, they are this kind of map. They're a 2D visualization with colors of some data that is associated to a geography. So that's great. That's very useful in many ways. Fletcher and other guys from the UrbanSim team showed yesterday how you can actually take advantage of that kind of maps to understand UrbanSim results and other analytics and results from their data science toolkit. But so when you're working with cities, clearly we're interacting with a 3D environment, and so for many applications, especially when you're trying to communicate with people, when you're trying to understand things like visibility or sun exposure, or in general what the form of the city in a specific area is going to be, a 3D representation can help you a lot to communicate all those ideas. And so what's kind of magic about this whole thing is that with a little bit of extra effort, you can produce this 3D model. So instead of stopping yourself in 2 dimensions and having these 2D maps, you add a little bit more of logic and algorithms and computation to this, and you can end up with this kind of 3D models. So, by now it might not be a surprise, because you guys might already know some of these, and we might have shared some of these before. And certainly we're not the only ones creating 3D models from geospatial data. But this whole model here was created without any manual intervention. So this is all based on the underlying tables that I showed you in the beginning. So we just have the geometry of each building, we have the footprint data, we have the parcel data, we have road geometry, we have the base layers to the background layers. We have attributes that allow us to infer what the 3D geometry of the building should look like. So, for example, we take advantage of knowing the building height, we take advantage of having some information about the building type, and then we try to map all those attributes into a 3D shape. And so this is a part of somewhere in I think Midtown Manhattan, and these are all buildings that were created only from that data. So what this means is that, all right, so I want to emphasize here that of course this is not a photorealistic representation of Manhattan. We don't intend it to be. because to have a photorealistic representation of Manhattan, you need actual data captured by airplanes, LiDAR data, so laser photos combined with pixel data, or you need to have a modeler that goes from place to place, manually creating a 3D model of the building. But what we've realized after talking to many people is that for many applications in planning and design, having an approximate representation of a 3D model that is plausible is actually very helpful, especially when you consider that the amount of time involved in creating these kind of 3D models is very low. So what this means is that we could create this kind of 3D models for any city or region for which we have this kind of data. So some building footprints, parcels, roads, building attributes, and the geometry will just be generated automatically, or as we also call it, procedurally. So here's just another representation of this is San Francisco in this case. We're combining terrain elevation data with building footprint data, and again, all this geometry is created procedurally. It's not photorealistic. We don't intend it to be photorealistic, but it's a good enough approximation of what the city looks like in many of these locations. And so another thing to notice here is that if for some of the buildings we do have photorealistic representation from either LiDAR data or aerial photographs, then we can combine the photorealistic data with the procedural data and obtain this kind of 3D models, as you see here for downtown San Francisco. So we have the Trans-American Pyramid, which is not a procedural model. It's the actual 3D model that was created by someone, and it's combined with a set of procedural buildings. Okay, so one more design objective that we have kept in mind while creating UrbanCanvas is that there's reason to work in different parts of a city or even different parts of the world in a segmented way, So what this means is that we don't see why, if you guys are, many of you are regional planners, you might need to be interacting with data and proposals and projects in different parts of your region or your cities, and to us it seems like an artificial constraint that you have to open a separate file to interact with each different proposal. There's no reason why it should be that way. The world is one big continuum, and you should be able to access the information in the world as a one big continuum. So that's also one of our objectives here. So in UrbanCanvas, you basically have a virtual world. You can navigate anywhere with it, and data will start to load as you navigate to the different. So this is all connected to a database, a geospatial database, where all the geometries are stored, and again, the data is loaded on demand. So let me show you a little bit of that. So here we're looking at the New York and New Jersey region. As you zoom in, parts start to load, and again, it's all in the same environment, it's all in the same model. No need to open separate files to go to different parts of the city. And so if you zoom in even closer, buildings are going to start to load. The reason why we have this level of details is that if we were to load all the buildings of New York at this scale, your system, you might either need to wait for a few minutes for everything to load, or the rendering might slow down a little bit. So we try to compensate for the fact that we're interacting with pretty large data sets. We try to compensate with that by taking advantage of level of detail. So as you get closer to the district level or the neighborhood level, we start to add more detail to the model until you reach the neighborhood level, at which point we load buildings. We also load trees and other 3D assets of the model. So here's just a video showing what I said.
Quick question.
Sure.
So what actually is true? Like we went back to that little focus in on New York City as a place. The building footprints and the extrusion from the footprints, so are true, right? And the heights true, the floors, and like the trees, like counting the tree, or is that just kind of a approximation? I mean, what we're looking at, what's true?
So let's put it this way: the more information you have, the more true and accurate your model is going to be. But we can make a lot of inferences and estimates even if you only have a little bit of information. So I'm not sure what's the case in this particular example, because for different regions we have different completeness in the information set, the data sets, and so some models will be more accurate than others. To give you an example, in some cases, for some regions we don't have building footprint data. We only have building data, and we have parcel contour data. So what we do is we know that a parcel has a building in it, but we don't have the actual footprint of the building. But we know things like the area of the building, we know what the setback distances are according to the zoning for that parcel, and we try to combine all that information into a 3D model that is plausible. Now, of course, if you then, as a city or as a region, send us the data set for all your building footprint, and that's, the accuracy is going to increase because now we have actual data of the building footprints. And so the next level is going from footprints to facades. If you have all these buildings are generated procedurally, and they have procedural facades, the ones that you see in this slide. And these are all styles that can be created with UrbanCanvas very, quite interactively, and I think Jason and Tomby are going to be talking a lot more about that. So we're actually bringing these design tools for facades to hands of any user. And so if you have a more detailed classification of building types for your city, and you have a richer library of building typologies, or as we call it, development types, you're going to be able to have a more accurate representation, and a building that looks more like what the real world building looks like. And then if you have, the best situation is when you have the actual 3D model of the building, which you can load into UrbanCanvas as a photorealistic building or a landmark building. So the thing is, as you know, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I just want to add something. So just to be clear, so there's a distinction between reconstructing existing. So we can reconstruct the existing world in a procedural fashion, and just to reiterate, the reason we're doing that is that often the really highly detailed 3D models are not available. So ideal situation is you have all the information and import it. So we're working on taking that prototype, that methodology of importing 3D models, putting it back into the main production branch of UrbanCanvas. The other thing is, when you're doing proposals looking forward into the future, we don't have that information at all because the buildings don't exist yet. So to have a rapid way to prototype urban form, this procedural approach is really appropriate. And the reason we went there first is that when you put the two together, the procedural approach allows some visual consistency and allows you to abstract away some of the context details that might be distracting. So we'll show a lot of different visual styles that have maybe less windows and some details that might confuse people if they're saying, that's my building and the windows aren't really like that, what is that? We give you full control over how much detail you want to put in both existing context and the proposed buildings that you're studying.
Yeah, no, that's great. I just think that whatever is fine, but I think as a point of departure for a conversation, like if I went out to a community group and said, here's your neighborhood, the first question is, how true is this?
Mm-hmm.
This space, do we have, what kind of data do we have? And, not a big dissertation, but like we've got footprint data, we've got parcel data, we've got this, we've got that, randomly assigned facades, whatever the little metadata
mm-hmm.
pieces. Because, when you look at it, you go, wow, that's true, right? Because I'm seeing it. And I think there's a still methods piece that we need to add.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the most important disclaimers that we need to make every time we're presenting this to any audience. It's precisely what you said. And I think, Jason, in particular, this is a conversation that we have very often at the office. I think from the software engineering side, we're shooting for creating detailed representations of buildings and forcing the 3D graphics side so that we can support a lot of triangles and a lot of textures in the same big 3D model. And then when we talk to Jason and Tanvi, who are more in the urban design side, they're pushing for, you know what, less is better in this case. Less is more in this case. We don't need to provide all that detail because maybe when you, and we're going to show a few examples of this throughout the day. When you're just working on a proposal, you just want to show conceptual buildings for the context and the background buildings, and then you only care about having a higher level of detail in the proposal itself and not in what's in the back. And I think these are all principles in architecture that Jason should explain much better than I can.
If I can just ask a clarifying question.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if, and I've heard similar kinds of questions and sentiments before, wondering if it would be helpful to have something that's visible in the user interface that identifies which elements are based on actual data and which ones are procedurally generated. So that as you poke on a building, you see a little set of indicators as to whether it's an actual footprint, actual facade, or what's grounded in real data and what's not.
Yeah, I think some amount of that information would be really useful. And I think it's not so much a disclaimer, but it's like if I'm going to interact with this,
just knowing what you're interacting with.
Visually, yeah, it's like, okay, so which pieces are the real pieces, which pieces are.
Maybe eventually we have error bars around the data, like Anna, you'll help us with that.
So on the data side, is there a difference between the actual data and procedurally generated data? So I understand that the spacing of the windows and the roof color is also random, but is there like a table from where these values reside and user can just set them?
So right now, the mapping mechanism is an attribute on a solar building that's called the development type, which is essentially the series of steps that transforms either the building footprint or the parcel into a model. And the way we've been doing it right now is a very manual approach, where we say any building that has space use of single-family residential gets a pitched roof and red facade. So that's kind of the simplest example. Or an office building is going to have a flat roof and be exactly the number of stories on the number of stories attribute of the building record. So it's a very simple mapping right now, but what we're actively working on is having a much more nuanced and configurable mapping. So, for instance, if you know that buildings built before 1930 are going to have a particular window configuration, and ones afterwards will have a different window configuration. It might just be a very simple abstraction of windows, but looking at the 3D model, you'll be able to say, oh, that's an old building versus a new building based on my rule for assigning a facade. So that's the level of configurability that we have right now. But
you'll be showing a lot more of that.
We'll be showing a lot more of that over the day. Does that answer?
Yeah. So once you change one architectural detail, does it become a different development type?
So there's some capacity for randomness within a type, or range. So we can say for this development type, apply this range of colors, so that you can have a single-family house that has warm-colored roofs. So if you're in an area where you have tile roofs, for instance, you have a range of colors. So you don't have to have a discrete development type for each unique visualization. So that lever of randomness within a type is really important for large-scale modeling like this.
If you have a mixed-use parcel without footprints, that would be procedurally rendered with different building types. Are those interpreted horizontally? Like, would you procedurally create an individual building for each type of built space that's on the parcel, or would that be interpreted more vertically, where there's assumed to be different, space within the same building?
So the development type mechanism for mixed use can work either way. So we'll give some examples of exactly that in the next session, where you can say the first floor is retail, and the floors above that are residential. And actually, maybe we'll let Carlos continue because we can show you a picture of that really quickly. But so that's vertical distinctions in use. And then if you have separate buildings on a site, being able to apply a different development type to each one is something we'll be able to do really soon. Right now we have one development type per parcel, but we're expanding that so that you can have that fine grain of each building has a different type. And building A might be residential, and building B might be retail. And being able to apply a mix of types to those buildings is something we'll also show.
Sorry, one more question.
Yeah.
In terms of the randomness within the given development type, is there a way to, I guess, kind of seed the rendering so that you can guarantee that you get the same representation every time you open it and visualize it?
Yes, seeding is a big part of being able to replicate random sequences when we're creating this kind of procedural models. So using a random seed is something that we definitely have to consider if we want to create the same model twice. Otherwise, you're just going to create different buildings every time.
Right. The way we've handled that now is to have a very tight range of variability, so that every time you open it, if you have, for sake of simplicity, shades of brown for a roof, it will be different when you open up the application again when the buildings are regenerated, but it's a very high priority next feature just to have that random seed that you've identified so that there's consistency even though it's random within the set.
Those are very good questions, both of them. Yeah. Thanks, we've spent some time thinking about. All right, any more questions at this point? Or all right, I'll go on. So if you notice, we've been kind of building up from having no visual representation when you just have the data in tables, going up to a 2D representation, a map, and then a 3D representation where you have buildings. And so a natural extension of that logic is to move on to 2 more dimensions, which is being able to support timelines or the time dimension, and then scenarios. So let me give you a picture of this. In most of the applications that we know, if you want to represent what a proposed development is going to look like in year 2015 and then in year 2020, most likely you're going to have to create 2 different 3D models, one for 2015, one for 2020. And as a result, if you make a change in 2015, then you have to go and open the model for 2020 and make sure that change is consistent with the model in 2020. And so, for 2 years, if you have 2 different pictures in time, maybe that's not such a bad problem. But if you have to do this for a development that is taking place over 10 or 20 years, and you need a representation year by year, then it might become a really big problem to make sure that all the data is coherent throughout time. And so, again, that's another point that we think it should be very critical in any urban planning application. And so what we've done is to index 3D models and data in general, not only in the 3D space, but also in time. So each of the parcels and each of the buildings in UrbanCanvas are assigned a time window when they are valid. And in that way, you can you're not only navigating in a 3D space in the sense that you're moving your camera to a different point of the map, but you're also navigating in a long time via a time slider that we provide. And Similarly, you might want to create more than one alternative future or more than one alternative proposal for a location, and then see how those alternative proposals change over time. So again, instead of having a 3D model for every time and proposal or alternative future combination, what you have is all the data in the same platform. You're editing in one single platform, and then what you're doing is slicing your this virtual world using again a 3D location, but also a time location and a scenario location. So this might be one of the slightly more complex concepts to grasp when you start using UrbanCanvas, but once you get a fit, it's a really powerful feature from what we've seen. So I think we have a video showing this later on in the presentation, and we'll be talking about this in more detail throughout the day. This is related to one of the earlier questions. So this is just a quick preview of what the development type editor looks like and how you can start prototyping buildings and developments using this visual editor. So again, we're taking advantage of procedural modeling here. We are using a language that is very close to the CGA grammar for creating 3D buildings. But we are presenting an interface, a visual interface, to control those grammars so that people who are not comfortable writing code in that grammar language can just use this visual interface and still obtain or produce a lot of variety and a lot of detail control with this interface. So this is a very basic example where we are just creating buildings with mixed uses vertically, not horizontally. So I believe this is a development type where we have the first floor of the building is retail. We can assign texture sets, and then we can and then we have a number of residential stories above that retail space. And so I will note a couple of things here. The first one is that not only are we creating a 3D model following these rules that the user is specifying, but we can also measure data based on the building that is obtained. So in this case, it's a pretty straightforward takeoff or data that we're evaluating. In this case, it's just the area takeoff for each type of use within the buildings. But we can virtually compute any sort of analytics that will be based on the building geometry. And then the second thing to note is that we're not creating a static 3D representation of the building, in the sense that we're not just able to show a textured model of the building. We actually have a quite dynamic 3D model of the building that we can color virtually any way we want, and visualize additional information on the same 3D model. So in this case, we could have these buildings. Not sure if we have a screenshot of that here, but this is a similar, close enough area. So we could have these buildings represented as a texture set of buildings, or we can also have the same buildings represented more schematically, showing things like land use or any indicator or any piece of analytics that we compute on those buildings. So here's another view of a slightly larger area where we have a set of buildings that to which we have applied a variety of development types, and we have, I think, 5 different use types: hotel, landscape, office, residential, and retail. They are distributed throughout this area, and then we can see a plot showing how much area for each use is available within this part of the city, or the set of buildings that are selected currently. Okay, so one more thing that we've been working on is being able to support tracking of development projects. So sometimes, and this is really with our regional planners things in mind. So in some cases, we might have sufficient level of detail to create proposals with the exact building footprint geometry and again, a high level of detail. But in some other cases, we might just be early on in the development process where we have some data about where development might happen and how much development will happen in terms of number of residential units or square footage of commercial space and so on. And as regional planners, it's possible that you want to have a big picture of what's the proposed development for your region over time. And so this is just an alternative way to visualize proposed development. Here's another video. So we can handle development projects as separate entities. They are associated to parcels, and you can assign metadata. Again, maybe you want to show what date the project starts, how many residential units, square footage, and then you can zoom in to the regional level and again get the big picture of development in the region. I think Connor is going to be showing more of this in the next talk. Right. So one big objective to keep in mind during, as we've been building UrbanCanvas is the possibility to let people plan in a collaborative way. So this goes back to the example that Jason was talking about earlier. We want to be able to have two planners from two different cities interacting with data in the same space. And of course, we're careful that permissions are assigned in a proper way so that a planner that shouldn't be accessing data from city B cannot just go and modify the data. But we do believe that it's important, again, based on many conversations we've had with planners over time, it's important that they can all be accessing the same data set so that as a planner in city B makes a change to a building or a proposal, planner in city A is aware of that proposal. Again, something we'll be diving in more detail later today. So this is more of what I was just saying. Not sure if there's any additional comment you want to add here. Paul has been a big proponent of this kind of philosophy for collaborative editing. So
I think questions came up yesterday about the viability of doing this, where individual jurisdictions need to hang on to their data and have authoritative management over that data. And while that is the status quo and the way we normally do business, I think increasingly we're finding that the cost of that mode is very high. It's the startup cost for any project that requires crossing jurisdictional boundaries is excessively high. So a lot of collaborative planning just doesn't get done, or it's delayed and it's very high cost. So this is essentially trying to create an infrastructure to support collaborative planning on a regional scale or a corridor scale as planning needs arise and change and different projects come and go. So we think it's got a lot of potential as long as we can handle permissions issues and making sure that the jurisdiction that owns the data has authority to write to that data, and other jurisdictions can view it but not edit. So we've created the permission system. We're actively testing and using it, and trying to roll this out initially in the Bay Area as a test bed. But happy to work with more of you to try this out and listen to what your thoughts are about applicability in other regions.
If, let's say 5 years from now, you had your way and UrbanCanvas is extremely successful,
that would be good.
what would you see? What would you see on the front? Who would be using it? And who would be interacting with the images? What kind of decisions would people be able to make? What do you envision if UrbanCanvas were to play out in the most successful?
I mean, I think we could start with the Bay Area as an example. the planning process that went on here to create, through a lot of negotiation between the NPO, AVAG, MTC, and the local jurisdictions, create priority development areas. And the process of achieving the regional planning vision is really ultimately going to be determined by whether or not those plans can be realized. And the planners that have participated in this regional planning process from the local jurisdictions still have to deal with their own constituents. Right? They have to deal with the developers, they have to deal with the community residents around those priority development areas. And we think that a tool like this could make it potentially a lot easier for them to navigate that whole process of interacting with their neighboring jurisdiction, with the city council, with the developers, with the community residents, and bring to reality a plan for a priority development area, for a transit-oriented development, for a corridor like the Grand Boulevard Initiative on El Camino Real. Ways of getting decisions made about zoning, about investments, about inclusionary zoning, and so forth, and coordinating that with transportation in a way that they just can't get done. So a more effective planning process is the kind of metric of success I would like to see, and one that's more transparent, so that more people are able to see what decisions are being made, how they're being made, can comment on them, can participate actively in the process. I think those would be great metrics of success. And if we can make it work in one metropolitan area, obviously I'd love to see that snowball and work in a lot of different metropolitan areas. I think we're seeing similar kinds of challenges in different regions. So I think if we're careful about generalizing the platform enough and listening carefully to what people's challenges are, we think this could really work in a lot of different places. So supporting collaborative planning efforts, having more public engagement along the way, more ability for developers, city officials, planning officials to all interact in a common way, and to have more realistic understanding of what projects and plans might actually produce in the real world. That's the direction we'd like to see.
I think an important element of transparency is ease of understanding and clarity. And the issues are so complex that having this 5D system is about simplifying communication, ultimately. And to have an elevated discussion with more stakeholders is really the goal. So if more people can understand more components of an issue, they're going to have a more substantive discussion about scenario A versus scenario B. If they understand, oh, here's the impacts. Okay, I can see the bar chart, I can see what it looks like, I can see the alternatives aren't so good either. This really is the best possible option that we have with the information.
I think this is really exciting, and not just because it's a fascinating tool, but given the fact that we're doing more influence development, or this influence development, there are a lot of questions on the case of how we're dealing with that situation right now. But as the presentations pointed out, thinking in 3D is not necessarily the way we as planners are trained to think, with the exception of a few architects and so, and it seems that some of the material that you have has a component of shifting from the 2D into the 3D, which seems that it would be, it might be helpful to have kind of a learning tool for us as planners, because even for our 3D decisions, we make a decision on zoning, we make a decision on height in a flat map. So how we kind of go from there to the 3D situation, I think would be helpful. I think the power of the economic data behind us and the activities and the land uses is something that we couldn't think about that before, and the transparency that you make in the process is extremely helpful. So I wonder if there's any room to think about more in terms of not kind of education, not advocating developers, but figuring out a process where we can open that understanding And two, I wonder if you have had any interactions with the urban designers, with the folks that are thinking from the qualitative perspective. Not, I'm with Jason. I think for what you have, less is probably better, so we don't confuse folks that this is the reality, that it's a conceptual reading of what could happen. However, folks on the placemaking from the qualitative perspective are also struggling with similar questions from a different venue, and we have been coordinating with a team, regional team of placemaking designers type of folks that are kind of trying to frame the same question that I see right. And is there any room to have some dialogue?
And I think that's absolutely the ultimate objective. And the difficulty that we're chipping away at is that there's a critical threshold of visual quality, and it's not just increased detail, it's kind of a beautiful artistic question too. You can't just expect that you'll click a button and get something at the level of a really nice render. However, we can get pretty close, and I think we're getting closer and closer by the day. So it's a matter of the ability to have enough visual information to communicate with a broad audience and enough control over that information, and do it in such a way that it's easy for a large number of planners and designers to use in a production environment. And I think right now there's a division of labor in planning and design and architecture between people who think about the policy issues and think about what things look like, and even people who create the drawings that people see. My ideal situation coming from planning and architecture is a virtual site model that has all the data and looks real. And then I can dial down the accuracy, dial down the detail in the context, work on a site, and then show people and say, okay, here's the reason I did this. Here's what it's going to look like. I can dial back up the realism of the context if I have a really detailed model that I want to show in context. And we're getting there. It's a long process.
I would just add a little bit to that, reaching back to the previous comments you made, earlier comments, that planners are trained more in a certain set of tools, designers are trained in a different set of tools. I think what we're trying to do is make it possible to have collaboration that works across boundaries and ways of interpreting and interacting with information so that you can switch views easily. Carlos showed the sequence of going from a table to a 2D map to indicators to 3D representations of buildings at a low level of detail to a higher level of detail. And I think Jason's comments are along the same line. If we can move in a really facile way between different ways of understanding context and place and impact, it makes it easier to have a learning cycle in which there's a collaborative learning process about what are we thinking about the impacts of making a transportation investment or a zoning change or a subsidy of some kind or a combination of those things. How does that impact the community? How does it impact it visually? How does it impact it in terms of traffic and other kinds of outcomes that planners are going to be concerned about? And then how does it look? So I think the capacity to move in a really facile way between these different ways of engaging is part of the creating a communication platform between different perspectives, different ways of engaging.
Just one final comment. You might notice that we're not really asking UrbanCanvas users to stop using the tools that they have been, or not the tools, but the features that they have been used to working with on a regular basis for many years. So we're not getting rid of tables, even though we believe maps are a good way to represent data that is on tables. But we understand there are people who, tables are better for certain operations, and you can search tables, you can sort tables, you can filter tables. We actually have a very nice dynamic table feature into which we have invested quite a bit of time within UrbanCanvas, because that's something that many people will like. We can easily switch off all the 3D models in UrbanCanvas and let people edit data and paint data and visualize data directly onto the maps as if you had no third dimension, no height dimension. And so it's not, we're not forcing people to make a choice between, either you stick with your traditional tools if you want to work with tables and 2D maps, or you come to UrbanCanvas where everything is 3D. No, UrbanCanvas is, if you want to call it in a way, it's backwards compatible with all the tools that people are used to working with. So we hope that also helps the transition be smoother for a lot of people. All right, so here are just a few isolated videos about other features that, again, we'll be talking about in more detail. Here's one for interactive editing. So again, we're just interacting with the data in the databases. So you can edit numeric data, but you can also edit geometric data. So it's just a drawing tool that is embedded in UrbanCanvas in case you want to. Perhaps related to the question that Scott had earlier, suddenly you have the time to pay somebody to digitize building footprints, and then you can do that directly in UrbanCanvas, load the background imagery, which comes built in with the software, and start digitizing building footprints because you want your data set to be more detailed than it was before. Or if you, of course, that's for representing existing data. If you want to represent proposed data, or data of proposed development, then you can also go ahead and edit parcels, merge parcels, split parcels, and draw new building footprints in each of those parcels. We also have this painting tool that allows you to edit attributes very quickly. So again, going back to my comment about supporting tables, you can go directly to a table and edit a specific value for any item and any attribute of in the data set. But we provide this mechanism to more quickly modify those attributes via a painting interface. So in this case, we're using the paintbrush to modify development types for a set of buildings. And then another cool part of this is that we have full interactive analytics. So as you're modifying your 3D models or the data of those models, you can actually see how any analytics, any indicators that are computed based on that 3D data are updated. Right, and this is back to the example of proposals that evolve over time. This is what I was talking about before, how you can have a phasing of a proposal in one same space, one same model. No need to load different, 10 different models, each of which has a representation of the proposal for a different year, but it's all in the same system. Let me play that again real quick. So 2014, 2015, some parks are developed, some high-rise buildings around I think this is a transit-oriented development. This is a subway or a subway station in New York. It's a fictitious project. This development is not happening that we're aware of, but it's just for illustration purposes. So nobody in New York who might be watching online freak out about this. Okay. So I think I'm going to stop here for now and open it for additional questions. And again, we'll be covering all of this in more detail. In the meantime, I like to point out that there's a fairly complete set of documentation available online today. In case you want more detail about any of these things, that's the full link to the documentation. Or if you just go to the UrbanCanvas page, go to the Synthicity page, there's the UrbanCanvas page. And then there will be links to the documentation from the UrbanCanvas page. And there are also a set of tutorials that we've been working on to better illustrate how to achieve certain results in UrbanCanvas around specific workflows. So again, it's all linked to from the UrbanCanvas page. All right, so I think next we're going to have Connor Hanley talk about some more features of UrbanCanvas related to how it connects to UrbanSim. But again, we'll be happy to take any questions you might have at this point.
Yeah, just two quick comments. One, congratulations on the documentation. I actually weeks ago. I thought it was pretty clear. It's nice. Yeah.
That's great to hear. Thanks.
Yeah, but getting back to the point that the topic that Paul and Miriam were just talking about, I mean, that's a pretty rich one and probably deserves a lot more sort of consideration. I don't even think we have the words really to effectively envision the transformational capacity or the transformational effect that these tools will have on urban planning. I just was remembering back to the late 90s when we did some regional planning here, and we used these place types around tools and groups and had maps, and we drew a bunch of stuff on maps, and then the planners would take them back, and 3 months later they'd come back with results, and I mean, what a nightmare, right? It was craziness. And the point that I'd like to make on this topic is that for me, what I see the potential here as is shifting planning from being about the parcel and the building and the zoning about that, the kind of the nuts and bolts on a little local basis, to really empowering and enabling systems planning, urban systems planning, where we really get to focus and define and focus the performance parameters that we want to see the system performing at, the quality of place, the quality of sustainability, the capacity to move and to access things, etc., environmental quality, and then in real time, sort of you'd have this regional pipeline, right? And you'd be able to see the design proposals that these individual projects have at any point in time. If I'm in San Francisco, I go down to San Mateo or San Jose and see this really innovative new design work that they're doing down there in this project. And if I like it, grab some of it and start using it in San Francisco in this proposal that I'm doing or somebody else is doing. And that level of collaboration and sharing is pretty phenomenal. And then beyond that, though, if you sync up to UrbanSim, you'd be able to take all the effects of all those proposals in real time and see what it's going to mean for San Francisco. I might wake up one morning and come to the office and boot up UrbanSim and run my land use allocation or look at the pipeline and realize that the projection for 5 years out is I'm going to have 5,000 less employees in San Francisco. Well, where did that come from? Oh, well, that's because Oakland just decided to do this other proposal, right? So you get this interactivity across the system. That's absolutely impossible that you conceptualize and have a meaningful discussion about now. How meaningful a discussion we'll be able to have, et cetera, kind of on you guys, right? And more to the social science, behind what's in the model. So that's what I want to say.
That's great. I don't think we could have articulated that better as we tried.
That's the perfect segue.
Yeah. And that's very much the kind of spirit of what we're trying to create. There isn't anything like it right now. There's no collaborative kind of environment in which to do that. No GIS tool really lets you do that. There's not any other infrastructure really out there. And it starts with shared data, and it starts with analytics, and it starts with design tools and bringing them into an environment that's also then a social medium and one that engages with the political process in a really direct way. Axel?
That's a quick add-on to Scott's point. Usually, 3D models get kind of risky because they add an extra dimension to go from 2D to 3D, but at the same time, they kind of feel the vision because they see, oh, now it's about sort of the visual reaction to what 3D looks like. So 3D models just without the analytics, it's like a dangerous tool to kind of shift the discussion to a more flat surface where you actually talk about, oh, it's just about your performance, but like tall buildings and you can see check out the other performance. I think if you do 3D, it's very critical to actually move 40, 50, 60, and however many dimensions of data you can actually look at, so it's not just about the form. And some of them actually have this much wider vision, so much actually go from 2 to 3, it kind of requires you to do a much wider set of variables that you can kind of make that critical connection because it's critical.
But just one thing, I didn't really say much yesterday. Everybody was, has been using UrbanSim or UrbanCanvas for a while. In San Francisco, we've had a small implementation of it back in 2007, so that it didn't sort of go too far.
But I just want to say right now that I'm really excited to be here with this potential. I mean, it's generational potential. And in San Francisco, what we're trying to do is really capture the power and the potential of the Synthicity tools and really use them as the basis, the backbone for inventing a new long-range planning information and analytics system that doesn't exist in the city right now. Whether we were successful or not, I don't know. Hopefully we will be. I'll keep you posted. But I'd also like to just note that all of us in this room are the core team for this effort, because everybody in here recognizes to varying degrees and sees varying potential here that just has never existed before. And I'd just like to invite everybody to give these thoughts and these potentials some consideration as they go forward in their own work and look forward to coming back next year to see where the discussion went.
Fantastic. Great segue into our next presentation.
So 2 things. I'm going to jump back into nuts and bolts, and I'm going to also take it as a very positive thing that probably no less than a third of what I'm about to talk about came up in questions, and some of this will be redundant because you asked the questions we anticipated, so that's great. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Connor Hinley. I'm also a data scientist with Synthicity. So this is the second segment of our morning session. I think for those of you, I think our agendas disappeared overnight, but if you go to synthicity.com, there's a link to the agenda on the website. So like I said, back into nuts and bolts. We've talked about shared regional data, but what does that mean from the standpoint of providing data that right now we load into UrbanCanvas, or Eddie or I or Jason or Carlos are loading into UrbanCanvas, and in the near future that hopefully you will be able to load into UrbanCanvas, specify which fields correspond from your input data to certain fields in the UrbanCanvas schema. So I'm going to take us through a little bit of the UrbanCanvas schema, what types of data we're talking about when we talk about the pieces of that, and then we'll talk a little bit more about how the tools that are in UrbanCanvas now can be used to interact with UrbanSim and what happens once the information you've added to UrbanCanvas goes into UrbanSim, and what you'll see when you port that back over to UrbanCanvas. So shared data between the users within a region. So what do we mean by that? Users can read and edit the data. That means allowing the counties who own the parcel data, for lack of a better word, they manage, they control parcel data. All parcel data ultimately originates with county assessors. So county agencies are able to keep eyes on the parcel data, for which they're usually the clearinghouse. Cities are able to curate development data, pipeline events, etc., and manage discrepancies between what they know about buildings that are on the ground and the information that comes into the buildings table in UrbanCanvas from the assessors. And additionally, so that managed regional data can be fed directly into UrbanSim, which is in almost all cases run by the regional agency. And then results can be ported back into UrbanCanvas, and that allows cities and counties to review the results at the parcel zone, in the case of the Bay Area, priority development area level, and provide feedback on the model. So give feedback on what we're producing, where development is happening, and give the regional planners an idea of if something's misplaced, or if feedback dictates that there's too much development going into a certain area. Is that a problem with base year data? Is that an input issue? Is there something in the model that needs to be tweaked slightly? It's those sorts of interactions and workflows that are very important, and we see as crucial between in the links between UrbanCanvas and UrbanSim. So, going back to what Jason talked about earlier, collaboration, like I just said, cities, counties, and the regional agencies, and having one centralized location where everyone can interact with that. And we've sort of talked about this through questions all morning long, and we'll keep coming back to it and keep hitting on it. But it's a way to make all of these processes more efficient and collaborative. So what data is involved? Both UrbanCanvas and UrbanSim at their cores focus on parcels, buildings, and zoning information. So parcel information comes from the assessors. Usually most of the building data are derived from the parcel information, and the zoning information comes from cities and tells us what can be developed where. And in addition to that, we've introduced through UrbanCanvas these ideas of development projects, which are sort of high-level, site-level, if you will, information about what's going to develop and when it will develop. And then proposals and scenarios. Proposals are very flexible means of specifying things like a site design, so you can go in and design exactly what buildings will go onto which parcels within your region, or you don't even have to be that specific. You can select a parcel or a set of parcels, create a subdivision, rezone, set that rezoning event for, let's say, year 2022, and then tie that proposal to a specific scenario. And we'll talk a little bit more about each of those pieces. So here's a really, really basic data schema for UrbanCanvas, and this also pretty much applies to UrbanSim. So buildings, which house residential units, which house households, are all tied to parcels. Parcels can then be grouped and aggregated up to the zone level, the county level, PDA level, whichever level you want to look at indicators at. And Jason talked a little bit about development types. So development types, for those of you who've used UrbanSim in the past, will roughly correspond to building types. Most UrbanSim models use some set of building types, usually around 15 to 20 different types for a region. And so you can think of these in much the same way. It's the combination of form information about what's on a site, the density, allowed density, which is tied to form, and the space uses. So within a development type, you can have more than one use, which sort of goes back to Scott's question about mixed-use buildings. You can specify multiple uses within a development type. And an additional sort of mixed-use nod to mixed-use buildings that you see here is the inclusion of development type IDs on both the buildings and the parcels. So you can think about in the situation where you're pulling the development type from the parcels, think about garden apartments where you have 5 different buildings on the same parcel. They're all exactly the same, and you don't need to deviate from the garden apartment development type. The reason that we've also included development types on buildings is more applicable to something like a regional retail center that has large retail buildings, but then on the corner nearest the intersection might have a gas station. So you might have most of the site as a regional retail development type. And then there's one building record on the corner of that parcel that has a development type ID for gas station or some kind of light industrial use. And so you can visualize different buildings based on those development types. So that's a horizontal mixed use, whereas the vertical mixed use is handled within the development type. All right, parcels. The most basic input for both UrbanCanvas and UrbanSim is the parcel table, and that's a function of the fact that usually buildings are derived from parcels. Most of these attributes are pretty well known to most of you. If you've used UrbanSim, you're familiar with most of these. Parcels are tagged with a zoning ID that dictates which allowed uses you can build there, and also the zoning envelope that you can build on the parcel. Proportion undevelopable is maybe not as familiar, but that's things like if you have a parcel that's partially within a stream buffer, say 60%, then you know that 60% of that parcel can't be developed to capacity. The buildings are the containers, let's call them. They're the places where jobs and households live. All buildings are tied to parcels, so any attributes on the building table can be aggregated up to parcels and up to any geography coarser than parcel that you want to use. As I mentioned, we also have development type IDs that are tied to buildings, so you can differentiate development types within at a sub-parcel level if you want to. Yeah, go right ahead.
In the case, I think some agencies do this in addition to us, whereby we subdivide parcels for certain convenient reasons. The large parcel, I heard somebody say yesterday, the Elbow Park, Woodview Park, that's subdivided. Primarily for TAZ purposes, so sort of non-legal internal agency subdivisions. How is that best handled? Sometimes they'll have different land uses or characteristics attributed to each of the subdivided parcels. Is it best to make them as one the legal definition of parcel versus the agency's representation?
So I think probably for the purposes of UrbanCanvas and UrbanSim, we would think of them, definitely think of them as distinct. And what I didn't mention here is that development type ID on the parcel doesn't necessarily always mean that there's a building. It can include information about the site around the building as well. So in the example of garden apartments, you expect there to be open space around the built form. So that can be specified in development types as well. So if you have an office park development type, that's specifying information about the buildings on that site, as well as that you might have surface parking surrounding all of the buildings on the site, which doesn't exactly get at the...
I think Daniel's asking about a sub-parcel geography.
That'd be a great example. We have a lot of military bases.
Right.
Okay.
Camp Pendleton, it's enormous.
Mm-hmm.
Big cities, size, and it's internally subdivided because there are different distinct land uses. There's residential, there's barracks, there's some detached residential, there'll be a shopping center, hospital, let's say. So, for all intents and purposes, it's federally owned. It's not going to develop outside of military's plans. But in terms of the activity that goes on there, and like I said, it's generally for criminal purposes. There's access points.
Right.
That things have got to be treated as one.
I think you could handle it either way, but I think having it subdivided into different use types is probably the most useful way. And then the last column there, the APN stands for assessor's parcel number. So you know we'll just have some kind of legacy field that we always hold on to. You're always going to know which parent parcel that tracks back to. But probably for the purposes of both visualization, well, definitely for visualization, you want to know sub-parcel uses on that site. And then also for holding on to information when you port over to the travel model, those might be useful, I think.
Just do both. Could you find one large parcel, let's say, you decide to find one large parcel, and then also separately find, even though they're not sub-parcels, find a set of parcels that go along with it, decide how you want to deal with style or analysis as part of development.
So Connor, maybe one strategy for this is using the proposal infrastructure, which allows us to subdivide a parcel and store that in a scenario. And that scenario could be something that's in the base scenario, but you preserve the original parcel geometry. And then you can lay out buildings or separate development types and manage it in either way. Alternatively, you could pre-subdivide the parcel and assume that something that has a shared APN, but for all practical purposes, you're modeling it so it's separate parcels. We've got some flexibility, and you'll see a little later today some of the parcel subdivision and other benefits.
Right, and in the same way that parcels get tagged with zone IDs, county IDs, what you could do is subdivide the parcel and aggregate to the APN or whatever the ID, military base ID happens to be. So you'll always have access to some aggregation of attributes that are on that parcel. So number of residential units, group quarters units versus non-group quarters residential units on the site, for example. You'll always be able to aggregate to a level where that's meaningful. Okay, talk a little bit about zoning. Zoning usually comes directly from the cities. In many UrbanSim implementations in the past, zoning has been collected at a regional scale. But I think with UrbanCanvas, we have a real opportunity to allow cities access to their specific zoning categories and their zoning maps, and the ability to go in and change the attributes, specify the setbacks, specify the FARs for each zoning category within a city, and then paint those categories directly onto parcels where they apply, and specify the uses that are allowed in each of those places. And we acknowledge that at the regional scale begins to get a little bit confusing, and coming very soon we'll have the ability to sort of distinguish your local zoning from regional zoning. So as an example, and if you're familiar with the actual zoning code for Berkeley and Oakland, these are made up zoning categories. These aren't the real categories. But Berkeley has its own R1 zone, and that's going to have its FAR, its DU per acre numbers. It's going to have height limits and so on. And that's going to be a little bit different from Oakland's R1, which might be more or less dense, depending on the number of residential classes they have. And so now what you can do is you can specify a regional zoning ID and simplify all of the local zoning classes into a smaller set of regional zoning classes. Just for the sake of making things visually easier to understand. So Berkeley's R1 category might roughly correspond to Oakland's R1, and that might also roughly correspond to Emeryville's residential PUD number 567. And so you can map each of those local zoning categories into a broader regional zoning for the sake of ironing out a little bit of that detail at certain scales. So we've talked a little bit about development projects, and this is just a quick list of everything that you can specify in a development project. So the name, of course, the year, or even the month and day that it's scheduled to start, the duration in months to build, the number of buildings on the site, average number of floors, whether or not it's a residential building, the total square footage, the amount of square feet per unit in residential units, the number of residential units, and then the interesting one here from an UrbanSim perspective is whether or not that project is a committed project, whether or not it goes directly into the development pipeline or becomes a candidate project. And I'll come back to that in a minute. And you've also heard Jason and Carlos talk a lot about proposals. So a development project is a site scale summary of a project. So each record in the development projects table is a different project with a different start date, and all of its attributes are just a summary, whereas proposals in the UrbanCanvas schema are copies of parcels and buildings that you can then apply changes to. So, for example, in orange you see an example of a proposal. It's just we've selected parcel ID number 1 and changed the zoning ID, and that change to the zoning ID is effective from 2016 forward. And then once you have a set of proposals, you can create scenarios. Scenarios are collections of proposals. So in the transit upzone scenario, you'll find both parcel ID 100,001 and 100,037, which are just example proposals. So for each change to a parcel or set of parcels can be applied to one or many scenarios, and each scenario can have a collection of proposals within it. And I'll come back to some more specific examples of that. So we just sort of shift from what's in the schemas, what's in the data that underlies UrbanCanvas, to where does that link up with UrbanSim. So at the front end, you can go in, you can explore your base year data, make corrections in the tables for parcels, buildings, zoning, or you can paint new attributes onto applicable parcels, or you can edit zoning that's applied to specific parcels. And then create development projects and proposals. Development projects, like I said, are the sort of site-level overview, and you have a lot more latitude within proposals to make different types of changes, and those get applied in different ways in UrbanSim. So these are just those 4 tables with key UrbanSim elements highlighted here. It's kind of hard to pull out exactly which elements are crucial for UrbanSim, because you can create, recreate, and change variables using basically any attributes you have available to you. So really, the only things that aren't crucial or can't be considered crucial for UrbanSim are things that get you to bulk information. And I believe the Proforma model is moving in the direction of using those. So soon there won't be anything in the schema that's not a crucial element for UrbanSim or useful to UrbanSim. And then UrbanCanvas elements, there are fewer things used direct in UrbanCanvas, but in the case that you don't have building footprints, those zoning attributes can become more crucial because you can visualize buildings based on the zoning envelope or what's specified by the zoning envelope. Skip ahead a little bit here. Okay, so this is the sort of linkages and how we're storing information going from UrbanCanvas, and assuming that UrbanCanvas is loaded up with base year data and moving through the hooks that connect UrbanCanvas to UrbanSim, UrbanSim run, and the linkage back to UrbanCanvas. So create proposals in UrbanCanvas, and that includes things like parcel subdivisions, rezoning, and specific site designs. And that's stored in UrbanCanvas on the back end in a Postgres database. And then tie each of those proposals to different scenarios. Again, those scenarios get stored in the same place. And then those get ported over to, proposals get ported over and they're tied to scenarios within the UrbanSim data cache, is what it's traditionally been called. And right now we're generally working with an HDF5 file, but we could probably also pull directly from the database. It's kind of nice to have that sitting on disk so you can access and reaccess without having to connect to the database. And once you have that into the UrbanSim cache, you specify the scenario that you want to run. So the scenarios you've created in UrbanCanvas can be accessed from UrbanSim. Specify what you want to run, which projects are going to be applied in UrbanSim run, and that includes what years they'll come into existence. And then generate a run. And that's mostly happening in a data frame. It then gets saved. Changes will get saved back to the HDF5, and then ported back over to the database and take a look at buildings in UrbanCanvas. So just for the sake of example, I'm going to run through. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So I was just surprised to see that in the list of elements, you're not one of the elements. It's like verb. Can you explain a little more about that? It seems like that's a big thing.
Yeah, I think that's probably only in the sense that they don't have to be there, but it is something that you can view in the table, you can aggregate, you can get an understanding for the number of households that are in buildings and the number of residential units that are there. So it's probably not explained well that this is basically the fields that are necessary for UrbanCanvas to run, but all of these fields, or the vast majority of these fields, are accessible in UrbanCanvas.
So UrbanCanvas runs,
So, Conrad, so I mean, basically, you'll be able to see that field in the table in UrbanCanvas, but we're not directly using it in the visualization of the 3D model. So we'll show the stories in the building that are residential as yellow or other color designated, but we're not going to distinctly directly use the number of units to do anything as a visual representation. We do use it for development project visualization. So we have this abstract 3D bar chart that's visible when you zoom out to the regional level. And that's more the number of residential units applied to the development project in the development project table. So the work that we have to do now is have a tighter and more transparent integration between development project data structure and then the individual parcels of buildings. So one of the things that's higher on our agenda is to be able to translate back and forth between the two data structures, the aggregate along the project and then the individual records. Where we will use that.
Okay, so now I'm just going to run through examples of development projects, proposals, and how those are used in UrbanSim runs, and what the resulting buildings are likely to look like. So this will look familiar to Dan, who's over there. This is a 10,000-foot view of Denver. Seemed like a great example for this because there's a lot of former industrial land on the sort of northeast side of downtown Denver that's sort of ripe or one would expect to redevelop in an UrbanSim simulation. So just zooming in, shooting up 3D buildings really quickly, and there's a site there right at the top in the middle of the screen that I'm going to zoom into, keep moving into. So 3 parcels, and we're going to look at 3 different ways to affect these parcels, pass the information to UrbanSim, and then look at what comes out on the other end. So the first, creating a development project. You have the development project editor on the right-hand side, selected the 3 parcels, specified that those are the parcels you want to use. Those are the parcels that get tied to the development project. Set a date for the beginning of that project, 2018. We might know that we have a certain amount of office space and a certain number of residential units that we want. And if you don't have a specific mixed use type for the combination of residential units and office space, you'll just have to select a mixed use type and then specify the number of residential units and the amount of square footage that you want tied to that development type. So again, high level, site level overview of everything that's going to be constructed. Let me just go back and the check at the bottom, the committed checkbox, if that is checked and we pass it to UrbanSim as a committed project in 2018, this project will be built. It's a pipeline project. There's no there are no checks on demand or whether or not this project is feasible. It's just going to be built. If it's not a committed project, then that goes into UrbanSim as a candidate project. So it's basically something that's going to be sampled in, and if there is demand in this area for this type of project, we'll build UrbanSim will build all or part of this project. So that development project gets passed to UrbanSim, and we generate a run in UrbanCanvas. You can, along the top of the screen, change to runs, drop down to run 100, which is the number of that run that we just created, and slide over to year 2018 and see that on each parcel that's tied to that development project, we've created 1 building, and all of the residential units and non-residential area in that parcel have just been proportionally allocated across the site. So it's high level. You're not getting a lot of fine-grained detail about what's going on within the site of your development project. But at the zone level, when you're aggregating up residential units and square footage, this all sort of comes out and gets aggregated.
I just want to add back on that image. You can see that this is the simplest possible building visualization. All we're doing is just taking the parcel geometry and making a block with the number of stories that's predicted by UrbanSim. It's about the level of information we get out from the simulation. It's a little less than the information that the simulations produce, obviously, but in terms of bulk, it's basically a way just to evaluate what's happening in the simulation. So we're not setting back, and I think what often happens in the visualization, which is therefore a caveat, Scott's question earlier, is that this is going to overrepresent massing, probably. If we take the whole site and go to the number of stories that's computed, we're going to get a very dense-looking urban form. So this is where we're doing work to have development types that will have a more appropriate visualization that might include setbacks and a more nuanced representation of density on the site. But for right now, it's basically just taking the parcel geometry and making it the right height so that you can do a touch check on whether the simulation is doing what you expect. Question?
Yeah, in that particular example, were those parcels vacant, or did they have industrial buildings on them before the simulation?
They're vacant initially.
So in the case that you have a redevelopment project in which there's existing space, how are buildings demolished in response to the new project?
In most cases, the way a development project will work right now is that existing buildings on a site will be demolished. However, with a proposal, you can hang on to buildings on the site, which is there's a lot more flexibility built into proposals, and you don't necessarily have to specify all information about buildings, but you have the ability to go in, subdivide a site, or hang on to a building and just add a new building if there are existing buildings on the parcel.
Yeah, the development project is basically a very broad brush way of asserting square footage of residential units and non-residential area. So, yeah, like Hunter said, the proposal mechanism, what we're calling a proposal in UrbanCanvas, is what you use to actually manipulate building records if you want to maintain some buildings and add others.
And it is possible with a development project. There's in the diagram there were the hooks between UrbanCanvas and UrbanSim, and with a little bit of customization, we can change how development projects get ported over, and it's possible to add a development project to a set of parcels and leave the existing buildings. But the way we've done it up until now is to remove buildings that are currently on the site, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Okay, so just in summary of development project, it's high-level information, site scale, so you're going to get effectively uniform buildings across the entire site. The square footage and residential units will be allocated across those buildings. You're going to get one building per parcel. The parcels in development projects don't change. You're not affecting anything on the parcel. So even if it's zoned for industrial and you build mixed use office or residential, you haven't touched the zoning on those parcels. You just enforced a change to the buildings on the parcel. And you have the ability to handle committed and uncommitted projects in different ways. So committed projects get pushed right into the buildings table, and uncommitted projects are sort of candidate buildings, candidate projects. So proposals give you a lot more latitude in how you specify, and I'll go through actually two different examples of proposals here. Same site. We still know that we want a certain number of residential units and office space on the site. In this first example, maybe we don't want to go in and design at the site scale. Maybe we want to just instantiate a rezoning in a certain simulation year and then let UrbanSim do its thing in terms of constructing the buildings. So you take those 3 parcels, subdivide them into 4 parcels, rezone the large parcel and half of one of the smaller parcels as office, and then rezone the remaining as maybe a middle density residential, apartment density, and then tie that to a specific scenario. So we'll call this the north side rezone number 12, which is probably not something Dan created. I think that was one that was just a test. And then push that scenario and all of the connected proposals over to UrbanSim, and then within an UrbanSim notebook specify the scenario inputs. So I'm just going to grab the specific scenario and then run UrbanSim with those changes. And if you're relying on the Proforma developer model to construct buildings on these sites, you're likely not going to see them all appear at one time. So you're only rezoning in 2018. So for example, we've pulled Run 101 back from UrbanSim into UrbanCanvas, and two of those parcels have developed in year 2018. In year 2022, a third apartment building is constructed. I think actually the second office building was constructed, and push the time slider out to year 2030, and can see that in year 2028, the final parcel in that site is constructed. So you're just specifying a zoning change and letting UrbanSim operate within that change. So you can combine parcels, split parcels, update zoning. In this example, zoning is adjusted in the simulation, in the specified simulation year, and construction is dependent upon demand, and construction can occur over time. So the entire site doesn't have to develop at once. And just one more example of specifying a change within a proposal is the ability to go in and with a minute detail, subdivide the site and add specific buildings. So same 3 parcels. But this time we might know that the largest of the 3 parcels is going to be subdivided with an alley running through the middle. We know exactly what the building footprints that we're putting on the site are going to look like, and how much non-residential square footage is in each of the office buildings, the number of units in each of the apartment buildings, and how they fit onto the parcels. And we can specify that in a proposal, tie that proposal to a scenario, and in much the same way, pass that proposal into UrbanSim, and that gets constructed in a simulation. So some of the next steps along this vein are the ability to manage proposals a little bit differently. So this would be something like enhanced proposal management means something like you create a proposal, say the rezoning example, and it's set to happen in 2018. You have that in your proposals table. 2018 rolls around, and you would get a prompt from UrbanCanvas asking if you want to move that proposal into base year data, because according to what you've entered, that should now have happened. So that's something that is in the pipeline, and tools to translate high-level development projects means things like you specify all of the inputs at the site scale, and then UrbanCanvas will automatically subdivide the site and allocate those units and down to the newly created pools. I'm going to let Jason talk a little bit more about that.
So this feature is hot off the press. This is the first day I've seen this, actually. Carlos just made this video of some work he's been doing, but it's a pretty interesting new feature that starts to address issues where you have bulk information about a development project. For instance, you have a planned unit development and you want to go from a giant site down to smaller sites. And again, because it's automated, it's meant as a gross visualization for first approximation. So this complements tools that we've built for manually going in and slicing parcels into smaller parcels. So we have the ability in the software now, and you can see here, so we have scissors, which let you cut up parcels, and now we have an icon which we will beautify. That's the automatic scissors that will automatically subdivide some geometry into smaller geometries. So what you specify is the target area of each of the sub-geometries, and then apply the subdivision. So as we change the target, we can see that we get more parcels. So smaller parcels, we have more of them. And there's really not much to explain about that other than as a way to disaggregate a geometry for the purposes of visualizing additional development. It seems like it'd be a pretty useful tool. So part of this is being able to go back and forth between a parametric approach, which means you specify the parameter and you run an algorithm that does this, and then the ability to manually edit that after the fact. So this is just automatic scissors, and then you can go back and refine it. So I think this approach of first pass in an automatic fashion, and then a refinement pass with manual tools is the direction we're going with UrbanCanvas. Particularly efficient and useful when you're working at large geographies. So pretty excited about this line of thinking, and where this also really becomes a powerful tool is starting to integrate roads and transit is in our definite trajectory. There's obviously a lot of development work to do there, but you can imagine a workflow where you change the road alignment and you specify the size of the parcels, and the parcels adjust. And we've done a lot of work on this in prototyping and research, and we're really excited that we'll be able to bring this to the software. So this is the first taste of procedural work at the scale bigger than a building. So we've seen it on buildings with development types, and now you're starting to see it on the sites. So
pause for here for a second.
Yes.
I saw some reaction. What do you think? Thumbs up? Pretty good? Comments?
No, that's great, but I would go further and add street development so that each new parcel has frontage to the road. Otherwise,
yeah.
Do
it, Carlos.
Let me
All that's going to work.
Take the microphone.
let me take that one. So this is all, of course, work in progress. I actually captured this video just last night because it's fresh out of development. And but yeah, there are many other parameters you can follow. You're doing automatic parcel subdivision. This is actually a topic that we have studied as a research topic with some level of depth. So this is the box basic version where you're only controlling the target area of the parcel. But you can also control things like the length of the front of the parcel, the street. You can enforce the rest of the parcel, describing now. You can also control some style parameters so that you have algorithms that work better and generate more plausible results, and you're working with blocks that have more unusual. So there are many details associated to creating automatic subdivision, but it's definitely an important part of the procedural urban modeling pipeline. But it's a very good thing to know. Yeah, I was going to show the Urban Designer video. Some of you might have seen it. That's an early prototype of how we want to bring in procedural urban modeling tools and integrate that into UrbanCanvas.
There's support for bench node, so that you would apply it to all the parcels that fit certain criteria. upfront?
Sure. So there are ways to you can combine a couple of tools in UrbanCanvas to achieve that result. Do selection by filtering data based on certain constraints, then select all those parcels, and then apply the subdivision algorithm only to those parcels. So that's something we support with current setup.
So just to elaborate further, I think a workflow that we would anticipate developing out over some period of time, I won't commit to an exact time frame, but is that if we couple with a prediction of taking a parcel and subdividing it, then it passes that information over to UrbanCanvas. UrbanCanvas does a geometry layout for that, and then you can visualize that subdivision. So yeah, this is a video that Jason's going to play here from the earlier prototyping research work that Carlos has done, which shows how all these geometric elements, let you describe it, not sure.
Yeah, it's basically just a bunch of attributes of the road network, the parcels and the buildings interact together and are correlated to each other, and then you can very quickly modify what part of the city looks like just by changing a few parameters. So we really love this kind of stuff. We love the fact that it's so responsive and that we have immediate feedback. Also, the changing the parameters in the model. The reason we haven't brought all of this into UrbanCanvas directly is we don't want to scare people away, frankly. It used to be overwhelming and intimidating for a lot of users, and that's definitely some reactions we noticed when we were showing this more as a research project. But what we just showed, having some automatic parcel subdivision part of UrbanCanvas is just an initial entry point of this technology into UrbanCanvas. But we anticipate that we'll be doing something similar with road networks. Jason, if you can fast forward the video a little bit, I think there's a part that shows how road networks are controlled. Maybe towards the end. Yeah, there we go. So here you can see how we're actually moving different parts of the city around and controlling attributes of the road network, like the distances between intersections. And so this allows for very, very quick prototyping, very helpful in different urban design workflows. So here you have the bigger picture of where we want to go just in terms of urban design. There are many lines of work here. UrbanCanvas is, as you can imagine. But that's a summary.
And I think a lot of this the utility depends on the scale of the site, obviously. And these examples are demonstrations of powerful technology that works over large geographic areas. But to a viewer who doesn't have the benefit of us explaining it, it can look like urban renewal in a really heavy-handed way. So we're careful about how we show the technology, but the use case of a small planned unit development where you might want to also build on the roads and cul-de-sacs in a very first pass kind of way, and then go back and edit afterwards. I think ultimately the utility of these tools is going to be how we implement the connection between the automatic and the manual.
By the same token, scaring people, do you actually large and small use of automatic? Do you also risk vertical parcels that apply to the same block for ASIN?
So we provide tools to manually aggregate parcels right now. We don't have an automatic aggregation algorithm implemented, but I could definitely imagine a very similar workflow where you could have a target aggregated parcel size that you're using as a way to evaluate different options of aggregation in a simulation. And we've talked about this a bit. Say that again, Isaac. High scare factor on the aggregation, yeah. Yes.
So is the intent here to change the base year data with the subdivision, or to actually tie the subdivision to a development project that can actually be enacted like in 2020?
The latter. I mean, the automatic subdivision is probably a poor way to represent conditions in the real world, because there's going to be many more factors determining the precise splits. So I think if you're trying to reproduce reality, which is the base year data, you're probably going to use a more manual approach. But that's not to say if the condition that you're trying to reproduce was something that the automatic tools gave you a rough approximation of, it wouldn't be useful. They're kind of independent tools that could be used in either way. So just subdividing parcels. Right now we're exposing that through our tools for developing future proposals. But as Connor mentioned, the ability to use the geometric editing tools and then commit those changes back to your base data as a data cleaning mechanism is something that we want to do. So basically swap out the old base years and put in the ones that you just edited. But we come against the problem that we talked about a little bit yesterday, where the more you start editing the base year data directly, when you get a new batch of parcel information from the assessors, how do you recommit those changes that you've made in the context of the application? So that's an area of active development and research as to how to maintain these edits across conflicting data sets.
This is kind of a sidebar if you guys want to, but when you paint an entirely new urban form onto a space like that, you know, that happens in big swaths of new parts of cities. It happens, period, all over Asia. And if we're going to meet population projections that the UN has projected, it's something like one city a week, a new city a week of 1 million population for the next 50 years plus. So my comment is that, you know, what you see there is like inherited sort of urban design and form concepts, right? But one of the things that's challenging us these days in the sustainability arena is like, are those good ones? And if not, what are the good ones? And not that we actually know the answer to that entirely, even closely at the moment. So it kind of opens up a research agenda, but you'll have sort of a design responsibility to kind of deal with that when you're going to paint something that new for such a great space.
Right. I think the way that we've thought about this is in those use cases where you're using procedural tools to generate urban form, it's a way to generate a first approximation and bracket a set of scenarios that you might then refine with a more nuanced approach. And I think if your first task is to do a more quantitative analysis of capacity, you can get that kind of number. How many units of residential? Are they close to jobs? Are they close to whatever amenities that are important? Is it tied to the transit network appropriately? You don't need to get into, are there bay windows on each building? You know, what's the exact disposition? You're looking for first order quantities, and then you can go back. So I think you know there's going to be a gradation of uses of this kind of procedural approach, and we do have a responsibility to make sure that we don't push the button that says generate ugly city and then go build it. You know, that's not what we're advocating.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I was using design and they're a big D or a little D.
Yeah.
But more in terms of the transportation network. Well, what transportation network are we assuming? You know, what kind of multimodal system? Are we really assuming, you know, a grid system, for instance? Are we going to daylight streets? Are we going to have straight roads or curvy roads? Are we going to have roads that are just pedestrian walkway bikeways versus, you know, full? Are we going to have, you know, are we going to recreate the whole urban space in terms of a rectangular parcel as the unit of the subdivision? Right? You know, maybe that's crazy talk, but maybe it's not.
No, I mean, I think those are the kinds of questions we want to address.
The assumption that we're just going to recreate.
Just as a general comment, in that research prototype that we did some time ago, the second part of it is actually being able to measure indicators of the forms that you're looking for directly in the model. So I don't know if Jason is bring back the video for a second and show the part where, you know, and keep in mind this is a prototype where we're just testing some initial set of indicators that could valuable. But what we want to demonstrate is that the system itself, the infrastructure is plausible and it's built with technology, the hardware that we have today. And so in this case, for example, we're actually visualizing colors of the building space and the amount of sunlight that is hitting the building over the year. And so it's not just, it's an approximation, but it's actually a good approximation. We're sampling the sun position throughout the whole year for different times of the day, considering the latitude of the site, and then coloring that number of total sunlight exposure into the building. So you get an idea of, at least in terms of that indicator, how good or bad your design is. So this is not, and this is something that we care a lot about. We're not just creating 3D models, we're not just creating triangles, we're creating something that you can measure indicators on. These indicators are very valuable for your design process. And that's the mindset we're in. That's the direction.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And the sort of adjacent kind of analysis you could do with this is not just sunlight into the buildings, but what urban form would maximize the solar capture for photovoltaic, for instance. So yeah, I mean, this is fantastic.
And you can imagine a product that if hundreds or thousands of designers are using this product and they're proposing designs and evaluating the designs based on actual indicators measured by the models, and they can start getting their proposed forms or developments. They can have them rated by the system, they can be rated by other users, and then you can share those templates for design with the rest of the community. And naturally encourage better and better design, just because others are being able to break, but not in other people and other systems. So ultimately, that would be awesome.
Absolutely.
So I think we left a lot of time to open up questions about how UrbanCanvas and UrbanSim interact now, and Connor's the expert on using them together. I'll put him on the spot. So, we're happy to take more questions on the subject.
If there are not many more questions, we could also move parts of the hands-on that we have to now, or even jump to some topics we'll be covering after that. Have suggestions.
A question with the new UrbanCanvas you're doing. Does it include any, even if rudimentary, network editing as part of a proposal? We have a lot of COD like proposals coming online. There's a lot of community plan amendments that are underway, and a lot of them getting turned down, in fact, that's specific to projects. Some way to the very basic level, include different network alternatives, different scale alternatives for these types of projects. I could see that in some cases.
Not yet, but this is, the reason, one of the primary reasons for developing UrbanCanvas was to start to address these questions, and we've been doing it piecewise. So we've been focusing on land use editing and visualization tools at the parcel or building level. The ability to do the automatic parcel subdivision, brought us down this road of how does that relate to changing the street network, and then the corresponding response to parcel geometry. So that's absolutely a main concern of ours, and we're going there, but it is not in the current version. So I think it's going to be a matter of a combination of node editing and being able to do scenarios for edges and nodes on the street network or transit network in concert with the parcel editing. So we'll be able to turn off a neighborhood or a large undeveloped brownfield, and then have a proposal which includes not only the street network but the parcels associated with that. So we're setting up the infrastructure to build that next component.
Just elaborate on that. I mean, now we're talking about prioritizing over a longer period of time. Your set. develop. Clearly, we've got the rudiments or the elements of the technology in hand to lay out roads procedurally or lay them out essentially manually with the designer, planner putting in those changes. We haven't integrated all of that at this point into the current version of UrbanCanvas. But I think what you can conceptualize is essentially a continuum between, on the one hand, the kind of really detailed proposal development where you know the footprint of the buildings, you know the street layout that you want to generate, down to the most minute elements of that layout, to, at the other extreme, the greenfield kind of development that we saw the urban designer video, where everything is being orchestrated by the planner or user of the platform, controlling the layout of streets and blocks and parcels and buildings using higher level development types. And in between that are all kinds of interesting intermediate points. So you might have a brownfield area where you want to remove existing streets, lay out some arterials inside that large space, and then let the automated tools lay out procedurally the rest of the details. Or you might want to drill down in more detail and put in more of that manually. So other use cases might be you want to preserve a few of the existing buildings in that space and lay out procedurally the rest. So we think there's going to be a really interesting mix of use cases across that whole spectrum. We want to gradually expose all of those, but sort of do it in a careful way that creates a stable system and one that's understandable to users and one that meets the most urgent priorities. So getting some feedback about what's useful and what's really an important addition is definitely something that we wanted to engage in some dialogue with people today and an ongoing one. So if you have high priority wish lists, useful to hear about.
One immediate next step that comes from an introduction of network analysis tools is obviously accessibility queries, and being able to go from a change in the network to the accessibility visualizations like the one Eddie was showing yesterday is definitely an objective. And that's the kind of thing that will then translate to vehicle mile traveled analysis in different scenarios, and then greenhouse gas emission calculations. And you can extrapolate the use cases for that kind of analysis as soon as you bring in the network. But we want to do it right, so we're being careful.
This is something that we're going to get to see 3D.
Yes, I mean, going down into the details of, do you see 3D outputs from UrbanSim scenarios? What Connor was showing was basically a block that is assuming a constant number of feet per extruded to a number of stories that's assumed by UrbanSim. That's the most rudimentary development type. We'll be showing a lot more detailed ones later this afternoon. If you have a more detailed development, basically template associated with a building type, then it will be visually represented as the more detailed type. So it's a whole spectrum of options that we pretty much leave to you. We've kept it as kind of didactic and simple in this example, but we can do showing floor lines, I guess, is the next level of detail. So it's not just a mass. Showing floor lines and then applying setbacks is another level of detail. Changing the roof form, and then starting to add facades. So I think as soon as you start adding windows and doors, there's a different interpretation of the results that we're very conscious of. But there's nothing preventing you from doing that using the system that we have right now. So you could have a building that has a setback on the second level up to a certain number of stories, then a crazy roof, and the building on top of that, the crazy birthday cake building. Totally fine if you want to do that. But we're keeping it pretty much level of representational proportional to the level of data that goes into the building. But if you have more data, more detail.
Just had a couple of comments more generally about the UrbanCanvas, UrbanSim interface and what we're trying to provide via UrbanCanvas or UrbanSim users. Those of you that have used UrbanSim over a number of years remember that prior to a project we started with Maricopa Association of Governments, there was no user interface at all. It's pretty rudimentary. And a lot of command shell text going by as you watch the simulation run. Clearly not a very good way to understand what's going into the model or what's coming out of the model. And then we created the Opus graphical user interface with a project with MAG, and then many of you have used that. And I think in that process we focused a lot on the modeler's task of specifying a model and estimating a model and the estimation results and generating simulation runs. But I think we really didn't get very far in terms of providing a really fluid way for the modeler to interact with the data. So we had a view, a kind of table view of the cache, the UrbanSim cache, as a table. And we gradually added in some very rudimentary 2D maps that were kind of clunky, but it was a start. And we really didn't provide any tools to help users create scenarios. So the whole workflow around creating your input data for the models in general, your base year data, verifying the quality of that data, were things that we didn't provide the rest of. Creating scenarios and moving them into UrbanSim was a pretty manual process, and I think all of you that have used the system over the years know exactly what I'm describing. And then to view the results, you had to take the UrbanSim cache data, move it into a GIS environment, and then visualize it in a 2D GIS situation. And all of that was tedious and time-consuming. What we're trying to do is really shorten that workflow, that iterative cycle, so that you can be much more productive in creating high-quality input data, your base year data, much more productive when it comes to generating alternative scenarios and taking different zoning, different transport networks, different development projects in the pipeline, and being able to really rapidly experiment. Moving that rapidly into UrbanSim, simulating much more efficiently, and then visualizing the stuff not just as 2D maps, which you can do in UrbanCanvas as well, but also as 3D representation. So it's more legible. It's a faster, more intuitive workflow. So that's the path that we've been on with trying to bridge the UrbanCanvas, UrbanSim workflows to try to make the jobs that you're doing really a lot more productive. So love to hear feedback about whether you think we're on the right track for that particular set of workflows, in addition to the whole arena of interacting between the regional planning process and the local planning process, and the idea of shared data repository to really make that possible. Any feedback about whether we totally missed the boat and you really were looking for a different set of features, or it's helpful, what's missing?
I think this afternoon we're going to shift gears a little bit and go into the territory that Miriam and Scott were alluding to earlier, where we're really opening up new possibilities for collaboration between planning and design. And we have this toolkit that is part of an UrbanSim lineage that once we start doing what Paul is describing, where we have a really intuitive visual way of developing scenarios, and motivated by as inputs to simulation, but in their own right, a useful toolkit for just comparing options in a visioning and sketch planning kind of way. We have these two parallel workflows for thinking about the future of cities that don't now need to be independent parallel streams. They can be interacting. And I think that's where we're most excited, is bringing a modeling and simulation approach to design and a design approach to modeling and simulation. So I think only through additional use will we be able to really understand what the real implications are, but we're pretty excited about the possibilities.
Yeah, just a point of feedback. I mean, from what I see, I'm, as you know, impressed, and I think I'm definitely going in the right direction. I'm not saying that coming from a very technical, background, but just from a user background. A few observations are that I think the potential that you're developing is kind of way out in front of planning practice. So, for instance, on those 2 points, you're going to see sort of an uptake and a gravitation to UrbanCanvas around the urban design piece, right? And it's going to kind of be in that mode. On the UrbanSim side, I mean, aside from regional agencies that are responsible for doing the long-range projections, or even some agency like San Francisco that needs to allocate into TAZs to feed a countywide transportation model, long-range planning for planners is 20 years because it's sort of baked in legislatively to the general plan requirements and update process. And on that, I don't know anybody that does beyond 20 year planning. I certainly think it's like the next thing up in terms of the long-range planning agenda. But I could be wrong. I had a conversation with the director of the San Francisco County Transportation Authority about 10 years ago, and I was kind of going on about the potential for long-range planning and how San Francisco could change, would change, and I started picking up on this sense that I was a little crazy, and at one point he just interjected, "Well, what are you talking about? San Francisco's built out." Right? So you don't really need long-range planning then. But I think that's more of a perception, right? I mean, because there's at least 40 to 80,000 units worth of development potential on a residential basis there. There's millions and millions of square feet of commercial. But hey, how far out is that? Is that 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? It took us 20 years to rebuild the Bay Bridge, right? Can you imagine what that discussion will be to increase the development potential for a city like San Francisco? And all of a sudden, you've got intersects with infrastructural requirements and water constraints, et cetera. So, I mean, I think that that conversation needs to happen, and this will be an tool report, but it's not happening in most places now. So, part of the so again, I think your development vision and potential of your tools is really pushing the envelope for planning practice, and that becomes kind of a public goods thing, just like the regional data warehouse data sharing piece. It's kind of a public goods piece. So you're kind of in the proprietary economic goods and service camp. But to realize the full potential there's this public service piece that somehow needs to get done by somebody, by some team, et cetera. I'm real intrigued with that part of it, and so maybe we can get a little on that, and sort of where we are actually. But anyway, so those are a couple thoughts of mine.
I think you bring up a good point about current practice is where it's at. And we have to acknowledge that and work within the tools and practices that people are already engaged in and figure out what a transition path to a different approach might look like. We're starting from, let's make what we do now more effective and more efficient. And hopefully that lays the groundwork for something that's more effective socially in a bigger picture like we're talking about. So I'm going back to this image of, different applications are used to do different things right now. And to some extent, we're talking about integrating and improving some workflows by bringing them together. And one question that I always have as we're talking about what features to implement next is how do we, each of these little lines is a data translation step or a moving from one application to another. Which are the most important ones? What are the biggest hurdles? Is it that everyone's an Esri shop, and the idea of having a parallel Postgres database is a nightmare. What kinds of concerns do you have from an implementation point of view if you wanted to go down the UrbanCanvas route that make you scratch your head and say, I don't know if this is a good idea? That kind of feedback would be really useful, because then we can figure out how to start to bring these tools into your hands in a way that's an easy transition.
I would say that you're definitely very far along the right track. In terms of something that might be helpful down the road are some tools to more than compute, sort of mass imputation or almost like data creation tools. For example, we have about 240 municipalities in Oakland. That's a lot. A lot of them are very rural. They want to stay very rural, and they don't do a lot with data. They don't have parcels. They don't. The only assessing fields they would ever fill in would be the taxable value, nothing else. So, in order for us to create a consistent data set, we have big holes. I think of imputation as sort of a cleaning, kind of filling in the blanks here and there. We actually end up with big data holes, large stretch that doesn't have a year to build, that sort of thing. I think maybe some tools to help us fill in those big pieces in a systematic, reproducible, and quick way would be a real time saver.
Yeah, and I think from a global perspective too, rural areas in the U.S. are one area where there's not a lot of data, but the areas globally where the most rapid development is happening are also areas where there's not a lot of base data. So tools that allow you to create a foundational data set for this kind of analysis would be essential. So I think there's a research project there, and there's a tools project too.
So, I would just add a couple of observations to that. Yesterday we talked about the Spandex project, set of tools that we're building. Those are essentially trying to generalize from the data cleaning, data integration, data synthesis processes that we've been involved in as we've worked in multiple regions, many of which have these kind of data holes. Even in the Bay Area, which has white good data generally, Solano County's data was really problematic. So swaths of missing data, missing square footages or units on parcels and so we're definitely focusing on moving further and further in that direction. I think the combination of the sort of data science tools that we've got and the procedural tools that we've got make for a really interesting combination. So you can imagine synthesizing urban landscapes using limited amounts of data, like the street network and some more aggregate census data, and filling in the details procedurally in a way that's consistent with what you do observe. And then that becomes a baseline on which you can improve. And as you can layer in more correct data, more directly observed data, you replace the elements that are synthesized. And gradually you're filling in more and more of the synthetic data with observed data. If you combine this with any level of, call it crowdsourcing or community sourcing, where more people can have eyes on the data and can make corrections to it, or make proposed corrections to it with the commenting features that we started talking about and are rolling out in the next maintenance release. I think that really starts to open up possibility to do something more like OpenStreetMap has done or street network data for the built environment. So I think there's a lot of room for progress in this, and we're definitely building a suite of tools and technologies that can be brought together in different ways to accomplish some of those work.
Were you imagining that local jurisdictions having to update their data?
So this is something we would love to get your feedback on. Yes, we envision that the idea of a shared regional repository is that the local jurisdictions with whom regional planning agencies are often having to dialogue about their forecast, their regional transportation plan, and so forth, are going to have a point of contact around what's already on the ground today. What are the land use regulations that those local jurisdictions have in place or intend to have in place about how development patterns be constrained by local land use policies? And also, what projects do they have knowledge about that are in the pipeline that should be taken into consideration? So the idea here would be that local jurisdictions could have a copy of UrbanCanvas. They would have permissions to edit any of the data that's within their jurisdiction that they have a mandate to manage. And those corrections, those improvements, would be visible then to neighboring jurisdictions, to the county, to the regional planning agencies. And that could become capacity that's maintained over time, so that every year we can roll in a new wave of data. We have to reconcile the edits that were made in the previous data with a new wave of data. That's still an ongoing and very big challenge. But this becomes essentially then a way to monitor development as it's progressing, to have an increasingly longitudinal data set against which to calibrate models and make short-term predictions to figure out how well they're predicting, and to serve all kinds of other planning groups. Imagine the value of having an ongoing maintenance of your parcel and building data and development project in the pipeline, changes in the street network, changes in zoning, and what you could do with that information, changes in property values. That's an incredibly powerful potential, but we're nowhere near that right now today. So planning practice and current realities are there's a huge gap between that and what we're envisioning. We're trying to figure out if we can take small steps, make this useful to people to start sharing data and collaborating as of now.
In our area, I don't know what the areas are, trying to do the software. Predictions are smaller, urging, they don't have the budget to implement that. But I think that might be a good direction to try and figure out how to implement it.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the value of doing something like this too that we propose and hope to see actually manifest is that it's particularly the area that have the resources to build their own data sets and maintain them that get to benefit. So if this kind of data set is built conversely by a larger jurisdiction that has the resources, the state or a county or a regional government, and all the local data is there in some fashion, then a local planner who might not have a lot of time or resources can use a tool that's a lot easier to use than a lot of other stuff that's out there to look at scenario options and do quick analysis. So the question is, how does the development pipeline project table get populated now? Because our primary users now are regional planning agencies, it's the regional planning agency that aggregates that information and puts it in the table. We hope that enabling this more distributed workflow gets more people populating that table with more detailed information. Could you repeat that? So everything is on a server, and the second that it's updated, refresh the application, information is visible to you.
Just to amplify on this, the development projects tracking is something that was a pre-existing workflow within some, maybe not all NPOs, Metropolitan Planning Organization. Many of them are already tracking and have been doing it for some time, tracking development projects either through initially newspaper clippings or talking to real estate developers or whatever their approaches are. But many of them are already doing that. And so what we're providing is a way to capture that information in a systematic way and then make sure it's directly usable in the modeling content so that we can look at how plan developments are influencing the market. And then, as Jason said, we want to make it possible to make it easier to maintain that, so it's not as labor intensive and more people are involved in keeping it up to date.
Start with Hannah.
I just have a question. Licensing in terms of the platform, like when everybody wants to edit the data, it's already license and wants to move it.
Good time for that question. So we haven't publicized pricing at this point, but I think it's time to actually make it more visible. The pricing pattern that we've been testing and seems to be working out pretty well is it's a subscription-based license for UrbanCanvas, and we've been licensing it at $5,000 per seat per license per year. So it's an annual. And this is for the fully featured UrbanCanvas license that we've been describing here. In the process of exploring different use cases and needs of different constituents, we also realized that a lot of different users might benefit from having a version of UrbanCanvas that allows them to see everything in the database, but not edit. So a read-only version. With one caveat, which is that so let's say your local jurisdictions in some cases, you might want to have the regional agency with the authoring version. And then some of the smaller jurisdictions, maybe you want them to be able to review your data or review your simulation results right, after you've done a set of preliminary land use forecasts. And you want to provide an efficient way for that kind of exchange to happen. So one way to do it is to provide a read-only version of UrbanCanvas, which at this point we're thinking of providing essentially in a bundled way. So if you have a certain number of UrbanCanvas licenses, the full license, you get a larger number of UrbanCanvas read-only version at no cost to distribute out to the constituents that you interact with. So they would have an ability to view all of the same data. They would also have an ability to comment on it. So you saw some of the commenting features already. I don't know if we're going to do any more discussion of that this afternoon, but
that was the primary example. Though.
Okay. But the idea of being able to either comment on scenarios that you've generated, input data, propose corrections to the data, things like that, would be available in the viewer version, but they wouldn't have direct editing unless they then buy also a license. Another kind of general point here is a couple of related points. In the smaller cities and planning offices where a planner may be wearing multiple hats, all of you are also wearing multiple hats, so you can appreciate this, but maybe thinner staffing in some of the smaller jurisdictions and not as much technical capacity. We're really trying to design these tools and the user interface for them really easy to use. We think that even tools like ArcGIS are pretty complicated. It takes a fair amount of training and setup and experience to really get comfortable with that. So our goal is to try to make this really easy to use so that planners that don't even have a strong GIS background could actually learn pretty quickly how to interact with these tools. And that it makes it possible for them to, even though they're wearing a bunch of different hats, actually interact with your data, add value to their job descriptions, and be able to do their work more capably. So, the licensing model would be UrbanCanvas licenses at $5,000. Mainly that would be the bigger jurisdictions and the NPOs and the counties, perhaps, that would be using those licenses. Probably some discounting after a certain number of licenses, but initially we're starting with the $5,000 licenses. And then free but bundled licenses for the read-only. So, comments or feedback or questions about that? The only other consideration for us is setup and effort. So Connor described the data schemas for UrbanSim and the data schemas for UrbanCanvas, and they're largely overlapping. They're not identical, but largely overlapping. So in the cases where we're working with a metropolitan planning organization to set up UrbanSim, we've got a good chunk of the effort already done. We have a contract with them to set up UrbanSim. In the cases where we're not working with an agency and there's no prior work on the data, that's a fair amount of work to assimilate the county-specific parcel data and other data sets and process them into a common standard. So depending on the context, you might have to incur some cost for the data setup to get UrbanCanvas set up. Are there any questions about any of that? Or other topics?
I have a question about customization of schema data. So schema for the tables. Is that possible?
So yes, we at this point have the capacity to add optional additional columns without any particular problems. There are certain, the columns that you saw as being yellowed in as required were things that are a common minimum denominator, but you can have additional columns.
Yeah, and that's definitely a big area of focus too, is to generalize this as much as possible. I mean, there's obviously the critical relations between the primary tables, but I don't have two regions that are identical right now. There is the essential overlap to make the system function, but having a smoother way of dealing with customized tables is something we're actively improving.
Can you comment on the licensing scheme you're thinking of for the web-based runtime interface, or if there is one yet?
We're thinking. So the dilemma that we've got is, as I briefly alluded to tongue-in-cheek yesterday, we want to avoid working ourselves out of business. We're making these tasks so much easier, and if we reduce that 70 to 80% of the effort involved in model setup to 10 to 15% of the effort. That's a substantial amount also of just the consulting activity that goes away and revenue that goes away. So we're trying to think about, how do we create value for all of you and lots of other people in a way that's sustainable. So the basic answer to your question is we haven't finalized a pricing model for the web UI for UrbanSim. We're at this point not ready to release it as purely open source. We may explore pricing options for both a hosted version of that and a local install version of that, but still protect some capacity to generate some revenue. So far, our kind of dividing line between what's open and what's not is we're keeping all of the analytics, as the simulation models, open. So UrbanSim is open. We've got open source Pandana. We've got the activity-based travel modeling is open. We finish implementing a regional economic and demographic model, that will be open. So all the kind of analytics that you would be using, the models that you would be using, would stay in the open source camp. But value add that makes it easier to use in terms of user interfaces, Canvas, things that transparency in terms of looking at source code is not primary objective, right? You don't have, as a public agency, any responsibility to disclose to the public how the rendering algorithms in the visualization work. But you might have a responsibility to disclose how you're generating your land use forecasts or your transport forecasts. So where there's a need for transparency, we're erring towards open source. Where there's no particular requirement for transparency and the algorithms are valuable in that sense commercially and can help support the rest of the open source development, take them. So we'll determine reasonably soon what the pricing model or distribution model is for the web UI. How many of you found that useful? Okay.
Similar to one that we've actually built independently, primarily for the travel model. I can see a lot of value in using that interface for an integrated run. It's still a manual handoff. Having multiple runs simultaneously. It looks like you can allow that.
Kind of getting back to the original question that Jason asked about whether it's UrbanCanvas was going in the right direction and issues there might be. The complicating issue that I see in your diagram up there is that there's not just one user, and it's not just happening inside of one, group, right? And so you're intersecting with multiple parties' separate workflows. I mean, not just separate, but different workflows, right? So some people use this application, some people use that application, some people aren't, et cetera. So that just sets up the challenge for you, but you really can go in that direction of being able to interface with all those things in a way that's really easy, but I think make your software more welcoming, and people sort of saw that because the set and everything really well, that if we weren't trying to go down that direction, ditch this, or just be happy that they could use their workflow with your UrbanCanvas and be better off, right? So that was kind of one point. The other point I wanted to mention was that one of the things I've run into with the land use allocation work in San Francisco was that we would build the first part of it off pipeline data, which is real data, it's good data, that's real money, right? But then there's this other part of the land use allocation that's kind of black boxy, and we would allocate stuff based on kind of a gravity model of development potential by TAC, et cetera, et cetera. And people were always very uncomfortable with that part of the exercise. And I was just realizing as I was thinking about it that with the forecasting that you do with the real estate pro forma model, where you actually have forecasted projects, that's going to sell long-range forecasting to people so much more easily and make it so much more accessible to people. And what I was starting to think about in terms of are we going in the right direction, et cetera, on the UrbanSim side, was one interesting little thought exercise, but maybe it would get into an actual pilot project, would be to team with ABAG to think about how you would roll out UrbanCanvas, UrbanSim in the next round of projections to the different agencies when they do their review, et cetera, right? Because if you think through that exercise, all of a sudden you start seeing, what the little difficult spots are, how people are going to review, or they can edit, how they can do that, what are they going to be able to see, and even, really the challenge there, part of the challenge you face is inventing the workflow, right? Because, ABAG has a workflow for their long-range projections, but if you stick in UrbanSim and UrbanCanvas, and that becomes part of forecasting and allocation, then how does that change the workflow in terms of review, comment, tweaking, et cetera? So anyways.
So I think that's very good. I don't know if, Jesse, your comment is related to this one or not. No. So how many of you spend a fair amount of time in the land use forecasting process interacting with local jurisdictions and getting feedback? Most everybody is involved in this business, right? And you go through this right now. I'd like to hear some examples of how you go through that process. Maybe a few of you could just describe in a nutshell how you do that. And I realize we're also at 12 o'clock, but maybe 2 more minutes.
Real quickly, we schedule a meeting with every county, and we're going to go out to the county with our dog and pony show, and we show them everything we've collected from them. So all their development proposals, their expectations, any of that stuff, we give that back to them and say, this is what you gave us. Is this right? Did you change anything? these are the preliminary results of our forecast. Does this look right to you? Anything you want to change? Get all their feedback. Give it all back to the office. Modify all the tables and stuff. Usually, adding development events or employment events, that kind of stuff. And then get it all back into the model and run it again. Small shell.
So there may be lots of variations on that theme, but that basic workflow is essentially what we're trying to find ways to facilitate. So that right now you're having to literally drive out, and you might still be doing a lot of driving out to their office. Human touch is not something to try to replace, but to have different ways for them to see what they're giving you back and see that it is in fact what they intended, and then be able to see the results of the simulation, and with the kind of explorer that Fletcher showed yesterday, or with UrbanCanvas, be able to poke into those results and say, here's how your inputs translated into these elements. Right? It makes the conversation a different sort of conversation. And sometimes the feedback you'll get will be aspirational or political, and it's not going to be so grounded in projects in the pipeline. It's no, we just want this many people, or no, we don't want this many people. And those will be at that point more transparently political inputs and constraints, and you'll have your own decisions to make about how to wrestle with that. But at least you'll be able to more clearly separate out stuff that's grounded in information and the stuff that's grounded in politics. And then it's up to you to decide how to resolve that. But to have a more transparent flow, an easier flow of information in from the jurisdictions and back to them, and show how that translates through the modeling, I think hopefully could be really useful facilitating that particular workflow.
I don't think we're a special case being in California, but our whole process starts with the negotiation of capacity up front. We come up with our region-wide forecast that's done entirely independently of capacities, known capacities. So it's more or less an unconstrained forecast. But the first thing we really do, the first time we go out and see the planners, planning technical, we're a single county, 19 jurisdictions, so it's a little bit easier. But the first thing we all get them to agree to is based on their general plans, based on the densities, based on zoning, etc. This is how many units we think that your city can support. And none of them ever agree with that. Your data wrong. That's what you told us, so it's a huge negotiation step right front. Oftentimes it involves us going back and saying that we need more. Laws of the land. So there's that whole upfront negotiation piece long before we ever actually run draft applications. So,
and then after you run the allocations, you also have
lots of back and forth. Usually it's one-on-one at that point. Yeah. So I made the comment yesterday, so we've been in small meetings with cities. And it sounds really crazy. There's a trading of, we'll take 500 a year. It's not a very data-driven process.
It's not a thing of beauty, but it's a thing of reality.
Yeah, and jobs, some want more, some don't really care.
I think when we
housing units are not.
Some years ago, I don't remember quite the time frame, but we were interacting with Maricopa and they asked for a set of features to be added to UrbanSim to deal with this particular process. And they had a specific name for this activity, and it was called the refine model. And so I at first thought that was kind of ironic. And I later came to accept, that's just the way it works. And you have to have something that allows different kinds of exchanges to happen between the regional agencies and the jurisdictions. Some of them are more grounded in data, and some of them are more grounded in politics. But at the end of the day, there has to be a way to work your way through that process. some case, do the horse trading and worrying and reallocation that's necessary. And we actually created some tools to do that. So I suspect some of the commenting features would facilitate this, and find module still exists. We probably have some reincarnation of that to do UrbanSim infrastructure. But it's still a necessary part of the process.
And I think just as a general comment, there's a really interesting analogy to having an automated subdivision of a parcel and the ability to go in and manually edit it, and the ability to automatically model populations or have a very stringent process for allocation population, and the ability to take into account externalities that the process doesn't account for. So I think just generally speaking, in a system like the one we're proposing that has a lot of machinery to make your life easier, the ability to turn off the machine and craft something is going to be really important, both on the simulation and the design side.
We'll take one last question or comment from Scott.
I was just going to say, in the San Francisco Bay Area, it's just like this process time is whatever, 110 or so, 9 counties and cities. And so, anything on anything that would automate the comment and the data revision, just in terms of electronic input forms or what have you.
And also in some sense, memorialize it and keep track of it.
Right, yeah, versioning, yeah.
Okay, well, I think this is a good time to call it an end of the morning session and take a lunch break. So if we can be back here at, what have we got on the schedule? 1:30. 1:30. So those of you that found your way to restaurants yesterday know what's close, what's not, and how long it takes to get back. So let's try to start at 1:30. Get off to the start. Is anybody planning to